All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Anastasia, and I am the events manager for Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Cafe. Thank you for tuning into this virtual event. We are here with the Read of the Day Book Club, a regional newspaper book club that is put on in partnership between Bank Square Books and The Day. And we are thrilled to have best-selling author Ace Atkins here with us this evening. And speaking with Ace is his friend and also day reporter, Rick Koster, who you also see here joining us. And I'm going to let Rick talk a little bit about Ace and his accolades, and then they're going to talk a little bit about Ace's new book, The Revelators. And with that, I'm going to turn my camera off and let Rick and Ace take it away.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you very much. As always, it's fun to get to do this. We've had a lot of fun with this book club, and it's a privilege, Ace, that you would join us. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Folks, if you're tuning in, you probably know about the greatness of the Atkins. If not, book 10 in the Quinn Colson series, The Revelators, is out. Hard to believe it's been 10 books already in this series, but long before that, I got to know Ace when he did a series about a Tulane professor who was a musicologist called Nick Travers. I hated Ace immediately because that's the greatest idea for a series I ever thought of, except I didn't think of it.
I'm glad somebody thought so. I had about 5 fans on that, so that's I appreciate that. You're one of them.
I love that series, and then you ventured off into writing a series of books based around true crimes of going back over the course of the 20th century, it seems like. Those were great. Then you had the idea for Quinn Colson, and The Revelators, as I said, is the 10th book in the series. It's come a long way. There have been a lot of changes going on in this book, in these books. And I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball because given your extensive history and the fact that you played football in Auburn and you worked for the Tampa Tribune and were nominated for a Pulitzer, you've been all over the MAC geographically. Why did you decide you wanted to write a series set in northern rural Mississippi?
Well, I ended up here. The newspaper business was kind of going through a rough moment when I left in 2001. I didn't really realize how rough it was going to get. But I latched on to this thing where I was going to be writing books full time. And so I had to kind of fulfill that. There was no job to go back to once I left the newspaper. So I talked to my editor. I was at the time, as you mentioned, I'd been writing a series of true crime books. One of them was about Machine Gun Kelly in 1933 and his run from the law. I wrote a story about Wicked City that was about Phoenix City, Alabama, the most violent town of the 1950s. And he came to me, his name's Neil Nyren, and Neil has worked with everyone from Clive Cussler to Tom Clancy, C.J. Box, and John Sanford. And he said, Ace, I really think we could do well with a series. You know, what would you, if you did a series, and of course, all my ideas were like 1920s San Francisco or something, that was well. And he said, no, we want to do something contemporary. What would excite you to have a reoccurring character? And I love those kind of books. I mean, those books I've been reading for years, and books like Robert Craze and, going back to Raymond Chandler. Those were the stories that I really, really enjoyed. So living here in North Mississippi, it just kind of came to me. I was like, some of these towns in North Mississippi almost feel like the Old West. And what would it be like if I wrote something that was contemporary but had the feeling of a Western? That way I kind of got to serve both worlds. I got to serve what my editor wanted from me to do something contemporary, but to do something that felt, wholly old-fashioned as well.
Yeah, and the title character, Quinn Colson, is an ex-Army Ranger who comes back to the town where he grew up and becomes sheriff.
Yeah. And
since he's gone or been overseas, there's been a lot of trouble. Was that fair to say?
Yeah, and it's a very old-fashioned story. It's something that we've seen. I mean, this is not breaking new ground where you've got a guy who's a warrior returning home and finding his world in chaos. I mean, it's as old as the Odyssey. Most notably, one of the other stories that I absolutely loved was Ross McDonald wrote this terrific book called Loose City, and it was about a World War II GI coming home to his hometown. It was overrun with corruption, and his father had been killed while he was gone. It was all very like Greek, felt like a Greek play in some kind of way. So I wanted to set up very simple. I didn't want an extraordinary, complicated background. I wanted something that felt very familiar, something that was very classic. And so, I just thought about somebody who'd been away for so long and then finds many of the same problems that they're facing overseas with, religious fundamentalism, drug dealing, corruption, things that you'd see over in Afghanistan. He comes home and he says, geez, this is stuff I have in my own backyard. What can I do about it? And that's what this entire series has been about for 10 years, which is trying to clean up corruption in your own backyard. And Quinn Coulson, it's funny, we talk about him. I say, try to explain the series, and it's hard to explain to people. It's like, he's an ex-Army Ranger and he's a sheriff, but it's not really a tough guy kind of book. I mean, he's not a super soldier. He doesn't come home. He doesn't have this, it's not an extra macho book. He's really what I hope to be is like a regular Joe U.S. soldier who wants to make a difference in his own community. And in many ways, he's not a superhero in that regard. He's really kind of a square. And that's one of the things I like about writing about him.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting from the word go, in that you do get the Army Ranger concept, and you think immediately, and I blame movies for a lot of this, because there are so many of them that are, they come home and take out 6,000 people or whatever by themselves. But
it's a much lower body count.
Well, there's very much, this is a story over the course of 10 novels. There's very much a story of a community. There is a large cast of characters. And in that, I think you share a lot with Faulkner and his county that I could never in my life pronounce the name of that. What is it?
Yoknapatawpha County. That's
right.
But I was inspired. I've got, you and I love pop culture and we love music. And for years, you and I have been friends and we've talked about movies and music and everything. And to me, it's all the same. I don't put, Faulkner in one category and Buford Pusser and Walking Tall in another category. It's all inspirational to me. So, I wanted to write something that almost, had the complexity of something like Faulkner had created in Yoknapatawpha County, but had the fun and the appeal of doing like a drive-in movie, like something like Billy Jack or Walking Tall or, White Lightning or something like that. So those 1970s films, that kind of Southern exploitation, or what they used to call exploitation, that's what was fun to me about the creation of this. But then having a county like Yoknapatawpha County where I could expand upon it, and I could have people come and I could go and I could write the histories of that world, and I could write about people coming and going and dying. And it's as we've talked about before, it's kind of like a sandbox as a kid trying to work in. And that's what Tippecanoe County is for me.
I have always, I mean, me, I was a musician for years, so it's not a successful one. So as a reader, a lot of what attracts me to series like what you're doing with Quinn Coulson is they take me to places that I can live vicariously through. And to me, northern Mississippi, I had certain preconceptions, although I had been through there, and it is a totally different world through the eyes of Ace Atkins and Quinn Coulson. And I'm addicted to it now. I can't get away from it. Do you find in capturing it that maybe people that aren't familiar with that part of the world wonder if you're being almost a little tongue-in-cheek? There's a lot of humor, a lot of down-home, what you might call redneck or deep South humor,
Right.
but it's also very dark stuff.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
I think it's certainly, hopefully, accurate. We've got a lot of rascals and corruption here, and as going back to William Faulkner, you said, in order to understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi. Now, I'm from Alabama. I'm originally from Alabama, but I'm talking about my people are right over the border from Mississippi, and of course, to many people across the country, it's all the same. In a lot of ways that it is, but it seems like for me, writing about Mississippi, I've been here for 20 years, is kind of ground zero to take on certain issues, to talk about you know, we're not exclusive in this regard. We see it all over the country right now, but to talk about racism, to talk about corruption, to talk about religious hypocrisy, it's pretty much all here. You know, it's all easy for the pickings. But I try to have a little fun with it, you know, and again, I think that's one of the things, the challenge of meeting new readers is, I think when they think of the books, they may think that it's a macho book and a tough guy book, whatever. But it's really, it hopefully has some kind of social commentary on what's going on down here. And when I first started writing these books 10 years ago, I think that some of these issues weren't as bold and you know, as entrenched as they are now. And that's what the stuff that you're seeing right now in the news, you know, things that are happening down here, you know, are issues that we've been dealing with for forever. But lately, they really have, you know, people have been coming out of the woodworks. And you know, of course, what I'm talking about is with, you know, racists, with extremists, with some people that harbor some really dark, ugly attitudes. I think when I was growing up in Alabama years ago, people tapped those things down and they kind of had it more contained. But now it's very blazing and very out in the open. And of course, what I hope Quinn and his people, the good guys, represent is people who want to see a changing and a new South. They want to see a new South that we've been promised. And, you know, again, that's kind of what the books are about. It's about the new South versus the old South.
Not to overly generalize about the Deep South, but if someone says, here's this series about Quinn Coulson, he's an ex-Army Ranger, and he comes back to Mississippi and he straightens out his hometown. Do you get readers that maybe are not getting what they want, that they're like, wait a minute, you know, are you getting flashback from maybe some
well, I'll put it this way. I think if people are looking for a simpler read and with more simple attitudes, which is, you know, kind of a pulpish look of right and wrong and, you know, bad guy versus drug dealers or whatever, yeah, they might be disappointed because that's hopefully what I'm not serving up. But, you know, like my last book, a lot of it was involving the immigrant community here in the Deep South. And this is something that actually happened was this time last year, there was over 600 people were being rounded up, undocumented workers, and taken to detention facilities. Children were left in these, you know, alone. They didn't know where their parents had gone. They didn't have anyone to turn to. It was a very ugly situation. Of course, what happens is the undocumented workers are punished. Nobody in the company that hired these people, these are these chicken processing plants. So again, I mean, that's kind of, those are things that I like to write about. So I get a letter, to answer your question, you know, from somebody who read the book. And of course they had very harsh attitudes towards the immigrant community. And so, you know, if you're looking for simplistic, you know, jingoistic, you know, that kind of stuff, shoot 'em up books, you might be disappointed. But I do think Quinn really is serving a thing that's not that much different than when I used to watch the Andy Griffith Show. And there was always kind of that moral compass that Andy provided. And I will say Tibahaw County is probably a lot more R-rated than the Andy Griffith Show. And, you know, and Quinn's deputies do have bullets. They're able to carry bullets. But I think that core of like just being a decent, good person is not that complicated. It's not really that. And that's kind of who Quinn is. He's kind of that, you know, he provides that role as the sheriff.
And you just answered one. I got some emails over, since we had an article run in the paper about you in the new book a couple of days ago, and some people reached out to me that were not able to watch this tonight. And one guy he said, how do you pronounce the name of that damned county? And he wasn't talking about Faulkner, he was talking about Tibahaw. So you just answered that question.
Well, the question, I will say the original title of the original county was called Issa Tibahaw, which is a Faulknerian reference, which is about an Indian chief that was here, a Choctaw chief named Issa Tibahaw. And that's what I originally called it. And my editor sent me a note. He said, I only have only one thing for you to change. He said, could you please give us a damn name we can pronounce? So for Southerners, we're used to a lot of Native American names, but he was quick to point out that some people, it's a little harder for them.
Yeah, it's interesting that this email had come from a guy up here where, you know, it seems like every other street name is Pequannock or Mashantucket,
Right, right.
Pequot
Exactly. Yeah,
Seapost or whatever.
sure, you guys
So um, in the Revelators, book 10, you have tied together a lot of threads that have been ongoing. And as a reader, you did, I think you did an amazing job of bringing a lot of this stuff to a simmering boil, not just in terms of a long-term narrative arc, but at the same time, you are reflecting what is happening in the world, in our country. It's a prism as seen through Tibaha County. It's remarkable how complex it is and how smoothly you make it happen. But speaking of it coming to a slow boil, you had to kind of make some changes here and some decisions as a writer. I'm not going to say any more than that because I don't want to spoil the plot, but was it something you saw coming, and was it hard to do? And clearly the series is going to keep going, but you kind of knew this was going to be a book that had some answers and maybe charting some new course.
Well, for me, I also, for some of your listeners up there and in your neck of the woods, around the Boston area, know me from writing the Spencer books. And so I've been writing Spencer now in the Boston area for almost 10 years. And writing Spencer is very different because Spencer doesn't change. Spencer is somewhat static, and you'd have, different stories that you're telling, but they're very self-contained. And for me, writing about Quinn and Tibaha County, this is a world that is changing all the time, and it exists in the real world with real time. Things are going on. And so I have to have characters come and go. I have to have things change. And there may be something that happened 3 books ago that's affecting what's happening now. There's a character who's this kind of, evil, racist politician that we've met 4 to 5 books ago, who's just kind of a throwaway character that we just know he exists. We know he's out there, and we know that he's working with some people in Tibaha County, but later on the books, he becomes the governor. And you kind of have a lot of backstabbing, and it's almost like a soap opera. I mean, things are changing with, the criminal element. And I was very inspired watching a show like Deadwood on HBO. And Deadwood, I loved how those story arcs were changing, and the alliances that were formed, and the backstabbing, and then people coming to power later, and that's what I hope to do with these books.
And that is very reflective of what's going on. I mean, and maybe it's always been that way in this country, yeah. But now this is sort of a writerly question, because you did just reference that, where I believe you're working on the 9th Spencer since the estate chose you to carry on that novel series. And by the way, if any of you out there have not read Ace's Spencer books, because maybe you were reluctant, or you think, well, nobody can do Robert B. Parker. Well, this is about as damn close as you're going to get. It is wonderfully done, and I encourage you to do that. Check it out. The rhythms there, the voice, the humor, the characters.
Thanks.
And vision for the future. But anyway, where I was going with this is, you're writing 2 books a year, man. In addition to other projects you've got going on. Can you even remember writing the Revelators? You have to, for doing an interview like this. I mean, right now, I assume today you spent some time.
I do. I've been spending time in Boston for the last 3-4 months. I think actually since the pandemic hit, I've been just mentally. I've been in the Massachusetts area the entire book. So then, yeah, I think I don't forget the book, but I have to put a pause on it and then go back and think about the book that I'm promoting. Because you really want your mind totally focused on that project. So right now I'm completely immersed in that world. But, as compared to, in my former life being a journalist, this is not as difficult as turning in, 2-3 stories a day, or, working on a couple of big feature articles, or doing an investigative story or something like that. It's a much more relaxing pace than that. So I don't brood over it too much. It's a lot of fun.
Can you hint at all what we're going to see Spencer? Spencer doing in
Yeah, sure. No,
around
no, no.
November or December.
This book is this is really kind of a Spencer story taking on the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. And Jeffrey Epstein and with Ghislaine Maxwell and their life. And I mean, it's just something that, I could have never made up in 100 years. And I thought that if there was a similar character to Epstein and was existing in Boston, how might Spencer deal with a guy like that? And so part of the book is set much of the book is set in Boston, and then some of the book is set in Florida and the Caribbean, and that's why I'm wearing this wine shirt right now, just to kind of get me in that frame of mind.
I don't know that it would be as much a concern for Spencer and Hawk as it might be for Quinn Coulson, but will you have to reflect life in times of COVID? It's real time in your book.
Yeah, I get answered that question a lot, and I think it's easier to deal with it in Spencer land, because I mean, the book I'm writing now, it could have happened 2 years ago. It could be happening in 2 years from now. It could happen 5 years from now. I mean, some of the technology, if you really pick it, it doesn't really matter. It's just, it is. That was the only thing that was asked of me by the Robert Parker estate, is they wanted the books to remain contemporary. And they felt like that was part of the big success of the series. So it's somewhat contemporary, but I don't necessarily have to address that with Spencer. But with Quinn, it is every year. I mean, he has a nephew when the series started that was 4 years old, and now he's 14, and so that's how that stuff progresses. So I don't know if I will address the pandemic in the next Quinn Coulson book, but the one after that, I definitely would have to. Spencer would be a tough one, because Spencer's a very honorable and respectful guy. He would have a mask on, so we'd have to do all the interviews where he's interviewing the bad guys with the mask on. So it would be a really difficult private eye book to take on. It's the masked detective. I don't know. I think, but I think Quinn, there's a lot more to address, particularly down here where somewhere in North Mississippi, where you have a great deal of amount of population who just doesn't want to adhere to wearing masks or taking in social distancing, and they want to kind of thumb their nose and pretend this thing doesn't exist. I know the county that Tibahaw is based on, which is not the county where I live, but one south of here, half their deputies a couple of weeks ago were out with COVID. So that's something, having to be practicing law enforcement at a time there's a virus outbreak. I think that's a story I'll write at some time.
Man, it's who would have thunk it, man? I don't know. It's fun, as you said. It's fun to be in Boston right now in your mind, because it's hot as hell down there in Michigan. I guess it's hot here too, but you can sort of vacation away from home, right?
It's hot down here. There's a point in the day, I think, from about 11 o'clock until about 6 o'clock, you just don't want to step outside. So I'm fortunate, I can't really say, well, it's so rough having to write 2 books a year. And I'm sitting in air conditioning, drinking coffee. I'm a lucky man. I got no complaints. And to get right now, I'm virtually, this new Spencer book, I have Spencer and Hawk visiting the Caribbean. And so I'm kind of thinking now, as soon as the pandemic is over, I'm headed straight to the Bahamas. I think that's the first thing I have to do. And then I can also tell my wife while I'm doing this, I said, why am I drinking so much rum? And it's research, it's all
research. Absolutely. Before I forget, and before you have been very patient. And again, we're very sorry about the technical difficulties.
Please. Yeah.
I promised I would ask a couple questions for some readers, as I mentioned before. Now, one of the main villains over the course of the Quinn Coulson series is a woman named Fanny Hancock. Do you want to describe Fanny, or should I? And there's a reason for this.
Okay. Fanny's based on some actual true life people. One of them was a woman named Fanny Bell, who I'd actually written about in my book, Wicked City, who was a very famous madam in Phoenix City, Alabama in the 1950s. And also there was a woman that was involved in the whole Buford Pusser real life Walking Tall story named Louise Hathcock. And so people think I've made up this name because, you know, it is a name, Hathcock, and you can extrapolate what you want from that. But it's not. It's kind of a combination of these two women who were, you know, very cutthroat, tough women on the vice front. And Fanny is very much like the original character. The real woman, Fanny Bell, is a very voluptuous redhead, but was, you know, didn't take any crap from anybody. And so Fanny's a woman I really enjoy writing for. She's a lot of fun.
Well, the reason I asked you to explain that is because the emailer read in the story Sunday that we published after you and I had spoken, and congratulations, because HBO is going to do a Quinn Coulson series, and that is spectacular. I assume you're pretty jazzed.
Very excited, very excited. Although it's a time to announce something like that during production shutdown. So, you know, all of Hollywood, all of Hollywood is shut down right now for the foreseeable future. But I'm hoping, I am very happy about that, because the genesis of this entire series came from the idea that was inspired by Deadwood, which was on HBO, and I think this is the natural place to, you know, come back around to.
Well, I think all of us who are long-term Quinn Coulson fans have sort of an ambivalent feeling about Fanny Hathcock, because, as you said, the woman she's based on is a voluptuous redhead.
Yeah.
And I'm going to quote exactly the email question. This is from Steve, who says,
"You sure you want to do this, Rick?"
It's very eloquently,
okay,
but it pretty much captures the idea. And who, in the name of eternal male fantasy, is going to play Fanny? So obviously they haven't cast it because there's no production. But you invented Fanny. If someone says, "Hey, who do you think should play Fanny in the name of eternal male fantasy?"
One thing I found out is usually, you know, going into this is you usually think that anytime your stuff gets into development is you think of casting. And for Hollywood, tends to be the casting is the very last thing they do, because it has to do with the availability of the actors. It has to do with you know, the certain directors that are attached and everything that's going on like that. But to answer your question, I do see a certain actress absolutely in mind for that role. And actually, when I write, I have in my mind, which is a fantastic actress, Christina Hendricks, which she was on Mad Men, and she's so great, and she can be so mean too, and so evil, and she has a certain, you know, quality about her. And so she actually has visited Oxford from time to time, and we have a mutual friend here. And from time to time, I kind of slip to her mutual friend, just, "Christina really needs to read these books." I think some point she may be hearing from somebody. I don't know anyone else who could play that role but her.
I think that Stephen, who asked that question, would be very pleased by that answer. I certainly am. So now it's good to see Anastasia back. It probably means we're running up against the time limit. And Anastasia, I know you have some questions that people had sent in, so I'm going to turn it over to you. If you got a few more minutes, Ace.
Absolutely. It's a pandemic. Absolutely. Are you kidding me? I'm sitting here. Of course, I've got all the time in the world.
He's got a beer. He's fine. So some of the people who were so great to attend this evening's event sent some email questions in. So we'll just try to hit on, you know, as many as we can. Ace, just let us know when you're all questioned out. So Christopher M. wrote in, and he says, coming from a grad student, he's a second-year MFA candidate at UM, right by you in Oxford, and he's studying mystery thriller writing. And he wants to know, how do you work to maintain tension and suspense surrounding the mystery across the entirety of the novel? How do you keep that rolling?
Wow. Boy, I should have prepared for this, Rick. This is a tough one. Back in college, how do I keep that tension? I think the tension, I think all tension in books, it doesn't matter if it's a mystery or it's a, a novel about somebody coming of age or whatever, is everything that's driving a good story is conflict. And, whether it's between Quinn Coulson and Fanny Hathcock, or a young person and their parent, or anything, conflict is what drives life and drives everything. And so looking for conflict between characters is something I'm always trying to do. And then the other thing too is, I hope the books have a certain amount of realism in them as well. And so trying to do as much research as you can to make sure that you understand your characters, that also will drive the story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Thank you. That's a great response. So then April wrote in, and she had some questions that you guys kind of touched upon, but I think it's great to acknowledge them. Her first question was, how the heck do you pronounce the county where the book is set? So say that one more time for us, Ace.
And I'm so grateful, because I still am kind of miffed at my editor for not allowing me to use Issa-Tibaha, but we just shortened it to Tibaha County.
Yes.
County.
Tibaha County, perfect. Because as I was reading the question, I intentionally didn't say it because I was worried I was going to stumble.
It's easy, just Tibaha, that's it.
And then April also asked about Fanny Hancock. And so she was sort of curious about, again, and I think we talked quite a bit about this, but your character development. And she was very curious and says, do you think there's a bit of sort of this emotion of being disgusted and fascinated with someone at the same time? Do you think there's a bit of that in every character you write, like this sort of deep, dark person, or?
I always, there are characters in my book that I don't, I think every author you talk to is going to talk about shades of gray and understanding their characters. And I'll be honest with you, this day and age we're living in right now, there are people I can't fathom their, their mentality. There are people that are living among us right now that I just are straight out evil people. And I can't get into or empathize with them. I just think that right now these lines, but somebody like Fanny that I've written about for years, I do understand, because she came from a place of vulnerability of a child, and she got into this life where she was either going to get completely sunk by it, or she was going to get some kind of mastery over it. And she ended up being able to have some mastery of it, which is in this really horrific, tough business of the sex industry. And that's what she did. And so I find that she's a fascinating character, that I don't understand her, but I also understand her ruthlessness. If she wasn't ruthless, then she would be pointless. She'd be vulnerable. And so I understand who she's become. There's a great series right now that's God, I'm trying to think what network it's on. It's called P-Valley. And it's about a strip club and about the world that exists actually it's in rural Mississippi, and it's terrific. The woman that created it, the writer, she's a playwright, and it talks about really all of the emotions and the drama and everything that happens around this strip club world. And it's not sexy. It is far from a sexy kind of business. And so anyway, that's the thing about Fanny, is I understand her, and I'm not repulsed by her. I like her strength. I mean, she's a strong character.
Yeah, awesome. And so then Blue writes, who is your favorite character to write dialogue for?
Wow, favorite character to write dialogue for? Oh, that's easy. That's easy. Quinn's, there always is a character who's going back to the old Westerns where you have a sidekick, and it's, so the Westerns where you have, I'm trying to think of, was it Fuzzy St. James back in the 30s, and, all these kind of great sidekick characters. And for Quinn, that's Lily Virgil. And Lily Virgil is a lot like women that when I was a newspaper reporter, I used to cover in law enforcement. And they were women that had to be most of the time, tougher, smarter, better shots, everything than the men. And so that's how Lily Virgil was created. And her dialogue always her thinking, and again, it's not like me creating this, it's just kind of coming back from things that I've heard over the years from these women that I know that have worked for police department, sheriff's office, U.S. Marshal Service. And a lot of them are saltier and tougher and more direct and say exactly what's on their mind. So I really love to write her dialogue because it represents some of these really strong women that I've known over the years. And so she's a delight for anytime that I have a Lily scene coming up. I can't wait to get into it.
That's awesome. And sort of a follow-up to that is part compliment, part question. Blue says your dialogue never reads like pure exposition. It always reads like a true natural conversation. Do you have a trick to make that happen? Is that something you learned along the way?
Well, dialogue to me is the most important thing to run a novel. And again, it doesn't matter what kind of novel it is, whether it's a crime novel or it's the Great Gatsby, which is a crime novel in some kind of ways, or Faulkner. I think it's really gets down to, I hope, being authentic and having characters speak as they really do. And I always tell people, young writers, not to watch TV for that, not to watch bad movies, not to watch, because people don't talk like that in real life. And the best training in the entire world that I ever had was being a newspaper reporter and having to write down what people say. And you become a human recorder of listening to the way people really talk, not the way they talk about plot and that kind of thing in a movie, but the way they really come about. And one of my favorite writers, Elmore Leonard, but also George Higgins from your neck of the woods, was the best at it. And he was a journalist, but he was also an attorney that used to read a lot of depositions. And when you read depositions, either as a reporter or as an attorney, you see the flow of people, the way they really talk. So anyway, I was really inspired by, by the work that I did and having to record dialogue as it really existed, not the way to make it function for the story.
Well, Rick, I only have one more question. Do you have any final thoughts or questions before I ask this? Because it's a nice end cap question.
I just want to say you're an amazing writer, Ace, and we're glad you took the time to do this for us. And no, I don't think I have any more questions, Anastasia. I got a million of them, but we'll
we would be here all night.
Yes, exactly.
I appreciate it. Thank you, though. I will say really quickly, I would not be on here if it wasn't for Rick, and having the connection in Connecticut has been fantastic. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we thank you for your time and joining us. And for those who are watching, we have copies of the Revelators and some signed book plates. So you can order that right on our website. That's banksquarebooks.com. And to finish it off, I'm sure you've been asked this question quite a bit since the pandemic started, but what have you been reading in quarantine, or have you been reading?
What have I been reading in quarantine? I wish I had more time to do nothing but read, because right now is the perfect time for escapism. But of course, I've been writing more than I have been reading these days, as far as enjoying novels. But while I have limited time, I am always reading. I read, oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of a Great Yale Doctorow book that was one of his early was a Western, just was fantastic. I also have been reading terrific book by a writer from my neck of the woods, who's a friend of mine, but also highly recommended. He lives in Mississippi, but he writes about his native Brooklyn, named William Boyle, and I would highly recommend his books as well. Of course, right now, as I'm writing a Spencer, I go back to read Robert Parker while I'm writing Spencer. So I've just finished up reading Cold Service and $100 Baby. And even though I've been doing this for 10 years and have had the privilege of continuing on Parker's character, I'm always amazed, and I always learn something new by reading him. He's just such a wonderful writer. And then I've got a stack this tall of novels that I can't wait to get to once I hit this deadline. That's what I'm going to do for nothing but about 3 weeks, is just enjoy catching up on all the reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some great recommendations. Well, thank you both for joining us this evening. It was a really interesting conversation.
Thanks, guys.
And I hope those of you who are tuning into this virtual stream enjoyed the event.